Welcome at Club Cloud. Welcome at the security cluster. Welcome Martijn Doenens again. Niels, it's Niels Sedemaker, right? Yeah. CTO, Go Data Driven. You are going to tell us everything about data, security, and we have a nice talk about the combined topic, of course. For me, it's a little bit difficult to grasp this combination of things. Why is it so important to have the security set right for the data environment?
When we became part of Xebia, of course, we are the AWS experts, and we build landing zones. We do all kinds of stuff with AWS. But when you're moving data, and I think Niels can talk a lot about that, to the cloud, you have to take into account a lot of rules and legislations and encryption. It becomes a different game. So regardless if you're using big data or customer data or just a website, it's important to make sure your data in the cloud is encrypted and least privilege and all those kinds of things. So I think it's always important to use security, especially with data, since you have data in transit, data in motion, data in runtime, data at rest. These are all things, or all stages of data where you have to look at security and encryption.
Yeah, and I think it's also good to know that I think data is one of the most valuable assets, right, for a company to have. And now they're moving it into the cloud. So while you're moving this into cloud, you better make sure that you protect this very valuable asset you've created over the couple years ago, and that it's safe and that it's maybe even contains PII data of your customers, so that nothing can happen to this data which might cause you harm reputation-wise in the future.
And why is this such a topic? Because I believe the same issue, same problems, same challenges, they apply also to on-prem workloads. Why is it different with cloud?
I think it's also that people have a feeling of control when they're running stuff on-prem, right? Even though it's maybe a data center, it's still a data center you can access. You can go to by car, look at your server, hug it, and then this cloud is like this intangible thing, right? It's running somewhere. You don't know where it's actually running, and that makes it a bit, I think a good feeling is that it's less secure than maybe the on-prem.
And does it also have to do with the exposure? So, for example, if you look at AWS, they come with a lot of services which are accessible via internet, via public APIs. Is it different than on-prem from a security perspective?
Yes and no. I think by default, maybe yes. Obviously, it's easy to configure all these services such that they maybe don't have a public IP. But I also feel that there is this concept of a steep learning curve, right? There are so many of these services, so it's how can you master or be an expert in all of them and make sure that you actually have ticked all those boxes correctly to make it secure? Yeah,
and if you heard my introduction, it's really difficult, especially to do both, to be a good data scientist, good data engineer, but also being a AWS security-minded guy, right? Or girl.
No, for sure. And I think that's the luxury maybe we have within Xebia, right? Where we have these dedicated companies focusing on either the data, Go Data Driven, the AWS side with Oblivion. So I think that's the luxury we have as a company, to have all those skills combined under one roof.
Yeah. So Martijn, looking at a new project. So imagine we are starting a new project, a data project. What would be your first thing you want to address?
Yeah, what I always do is try to look at risks. What are you going to do in the public cloud? What are risks that are involved with this journey that you're onto? And what we often see is a risk that the native services that companies start to move too quickly. So you have to get a good cloud foundation. The risk is that you don't configure your VPC correctly, and you just start next finish. As I say, not really in real life, of course, but you start way too fast without looking at all these services that you're going to consume and configure them correctly, as Niels already states. So these are a couple of risks that I'm showing on the screen. The core services are not correctly used or configured incorrectly. You don't have any idea of the current state of your cloud and those kind of things.
And that if something happens, a security incident, that will throw your project back like a year or something.
Yeah, and it's also, of course, from a board point of view, you need to have some success. Because, as you state, it's a bit that most companies are a bit reluctant to move the data to the cloud. because of all the news that's out there. It's publicly accessible. So it's bad for your internal marketing if it turns out that your data was accessible in, again, an S3 publicly accessible bucket, for instance.
And if you want to accelerate this part of the project, do you have some recommendations?
You mean best practices already?
Yeah, or an implementation, or what would be your approach?
My approach would be to build a solid cloud foundation, a foundation in the cloud where you use all the best practices that are available, create a good infrastructure so that the services that the team of Niels are going to use have a good landing zone to land on. I mean, we are the experts on the platform itself. So looking at VPCs and subnets, as we spoke earlier about guard duty, do detective controls, preventive controls, build guardrails around your AWS account. Make sure the basis, you have a solid basis to build on with all the security controls in place. Maybe connected to a security operations center, those kind of things. And one of the most important things that we always use as a design principle is encrypt on less. And maybe that's the question for later. Maybe there are cases that you don't want to encrypt when processing data. But I don't know. Maybe that's something Niels maybe can answer later on. But one of the most important principles is use least privilege. Only make data accessible for the systems, services, people, users that need to have access to the data, and only specify the access that they do really need.
Yeah, so this is really from a platform perspective, but once you start moving data to the cloud, you're going a little bit higher in the stack, so you move towards end users, for example. Do you have some recommendations from a data point of view on where you should start?
I think it's also good to know if you're looking at data, what types of data you have. I already mentioned PII, so personal identifiable information. That's a certain type of information you maybe want to treat differently than everything else, right? HR data, that's also this special category where you maybe need to take care while processing those kinds of data. And then if you identify those, then okay, how do you want to process this data? How do you want to maybe implement stuff like right to be forgotten, which is now within GDPR a thing you need to comply to? That all impacts how you store your data, how you process your data, and also how your users are interacting with the data.
And do you also see some challenges, for example, if you combine security with scalability?
Sometimes, so I think let's in the big data world, there's a couple of these frameworks. Spark is a very prominent example, which do well processing large amounts of data. But if you've decided to maybe store your normal data separately from your PII data, and store maybe your PII data in a database instead of on files on a S3 bucket, let's say. Yeah, then Spark maybe cannot access these PII data, or it can, but it will involve like used cost, or you need to scale this database a lot. So there's sometimes these two concepts they interact. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and do you also see challenges, for example, in when you want to move to a more fine-grained security model for the data?
Yeah, so fine-grained, I think that's one of the strengths of AWS, if you compare it to the other clouds. So AWS with Lake Formation, you have this central place where you can manage this fine-grained access. So I think in the case of AWS, you have this nice place where you can do that. Other clouds, sometimes a bit more difficult, sometimes at least different. Let's call it like that. But yeah, with AWS and Lake Formation, you have this centralized place where you can do fine-grained access control.
And do you also have some recommendation if you want to embed this, for example, in a corporate directory?
Yeah, so with corporate, it integrates everything. So with Lake Formation, basically you can give access to EIM roles or groups. To access certain databases, to access certain columns or even rows in a particular database. And that's all completely more or less transparent from a user. And that integrates automatically in Athena and in Redshift.
Yeah. And what are typically risks you identify during a project?
With regard to security and data?
Yeah.
So I think GDPR and right to be forgotten, that's something you need to address early on. How are we going to implement these things? For instance, I think right to be forgotten, on a low level, at its core, it's quite an easy concept to grasp. You need to delete PII data if a customer requests you to delete it. Okay, but then I delete maybe from my raw layer where everything lands. I delete a particular row. But how am I going to basically implement, let's say, that all subsequent or all derivative information is also cleaned, right? And these kinds of processes, there's no nicely packaged solutions as of yet, right? You need to typically still do that custom, manual, or at least think of something.
And will it help to work with encryption services? For example, what if I give every customer a single encryption key?
No, for sure, yeah. That's an interesting approach, right? So you basically encrypt every customer with its own key, and whenever you want to basically remove the data of a particular customer, you just void the key, and you cannot decrypt it anymore, and you're golden. Yeah.
But you're a little bit hesitant because...
Yeah, so typically, that works, but it doesn't always work with all tools, for instance, that scientists want to use. So this custom encryption, or this encryption you're adding for each customer, that also needs to be compatible with all the applications which are reading the data.
So it also adds complexity to the daily operations of a data scientist that's using lake formation and using all the other tools to their disposal.
For sure. And then and it's always a trade-off, right? So maybe that's worth it because you don't have a big data science department. Maybe all data scientists only rarely need to access PII data. Mm-hmm. But it's a trade-off you need to make carefully.
Yeah, exactly.
And which AWS services are commonly used inside a data platform?
I think, so I mentioned lake formation already. So within lake formation, basically it's a wrapper around a couple of AWS services. And then with regard to data, S3, you need to store it somewhere. Glue Data Catalog, that's something we use often to basically catalog where data is stored. And then things like Athena, EMR, Redshift, those are services.
And is there a common approach for all those services to basically work on the right security stuff?
Well, the approach is, in my opinion, always use the least privilege and use encrypt unless. The unless is, of course, the question, if is encryption always necessary? If it's not PII data, if it's just metrics, maybe you do not need encryption. Or some cases you do need encryption. That's a question more for Niels. How do you approach that in your solutions? Do you encrypt everything?
At rest, I think, there's because it's transparent, it typically doesn't really cost anything.
Exactly.
I cannot come up with a reason why not to encrypt at rest.
And doing it afterwards is a pain because then you have to load all the data again into, for example, S3 with an encryption key.
For sure. Yeah. So at rest, I think yes. During flight, so between, let's say, services, that's sometimes that has a performance impact. So within EMR, you could maybe turn it off, maybe turn it on. That's a discussion to have with the client.
And from a landing zone perspective, are there things you want to monitor when you are using those data services?
Well, basically from the landing zone perspective, it's the usual suspects that you want to monitor, like IAM role usage, what kind of policies you have, the normal stuff like root account usage, the basic AWS stuff. But from a monitoring perspective, it's also good, and that's one of the best practices that I've written down here. Make sure your landing zone that you build and the services that you use are compliant with the rules that you check. Because we often see that something that we build is good on day one and it's compliant, but the level of compliancy degrades after some time. And it's important to keep checking it with native services or some tooling. And it's interesting to see that there are quite some rules that you can use on the services that you just mentioned, like EMR and Glue and Lake Formation, where certain best practices can be checked on a regular basis. So to make sure that the cloud environment that you use for data processing is still compliant to the framework that you use to check.
Yeah, but Niels mentioned, I think, in the beginning that some of the data can be considered as your crown jewels. Are there any additional controls you want to apply to those data sets?
Yeah, as much isolation, separation as possible. Use separate services, separate accounts, maybe even from landing zone perspective. If it's usable, if it's feasible to use that in a solution, of course, that's a different question. But from our perspective, from an AWS landing zone perspective, we would definitely use different guardrails and security around these crown jewels. And as you said, data is the new oil, basically. And everything you do in security, and even in AWS, should be data-centric. So you build your security around your crown jewels, around your core data.
Yeah, and can you also, because that's thinking a little bit outside of it, can you also use a data lake, for example, to host your security events?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in our previous talk, we were talking about security operations. We gather a lot of security data in AWS, or data that can be considered security data. A security data lake, if your company has the right scale, you can use Lake Formation to ingest CloudTrail information and just use all the tools at your disposal to, analyze stuff and maybe get some interesting results out of that.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting approach to maybe even move away from having like a central data platform to having multiple instances of the same platform, right? So obviously in the cloud we use infrastructure as code a lot. While if you've made that investment to have your whole platform as infrastructure as code, why not deploy it a couple times, right? Why not have, if you have a dedicated crown jewels platform, why not have a separate data platform for that to really guard or isolate that from maybe the more general data platform where different departments operate. Yeah. I think HR is a good example of this, right? So HR, we typically never recommend people to mix and match, even though you can secure it in a single data platform, right? It's just, if you make a mistake, you have access to salaries of your colleagues and whatnot. So I think typically what we recommend, just do multiple instances of the same platform. A lot of these services are pay-per-use anyway, so it doesn't really matter. And then you'll guard off your crown jewels or your HR data in this case, completely separate.
And then maybe also only expose what you actually need. You don't have to publish the entire HR database to every stakeholder. You can also make a subset of that, of course.
No, for sure, yeah, and but that's even, I guess, at the ingestion level, right? So, do you need to actually ingest all this data into your data platform? I think that also needs to be a question decision.
And are there tools or services available on AWS to make your life easier when it comes to data pipelines, etc.?
I think, so with AWS Glue, right, you have these Glue workflows. I think that's a nicely managed approach to it. If you probably need a bit more flexibility, you can go to this managed Airflow they now also provide. That gives you a bit more flexibility probably. So these, and I think also DMS, Data Migration Services, also maybe golden oldie, but it's still nice to have it in the catalog.
Yeah, and the name is somewhat misleading because we normally don't use it for database migration, but we use it to keep databases replicated or in sync.
Sure.
And also with on-prem, for example. And are there any other recent developments which are changing our world in the coming 2 to 3 years?
I think on a high level, right, I think we're slowly moving maybe away from, like I said, we did a lot of Spark, a lot of Hadoop, maybe EMR still at customers. I think slowly we're moving as a sector, let's say, to maybe Redshift, like these more managed solutions, right? I think also Redshift now has these separate instance types. I think the RA3s, which split compute and storage. So that's a nice development, and I think slowly we're moving towards that direction in the future. Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
and did we also see some developments around things like late formation forward?
It's continuously being improved, right? I think last what I saw is that they have these blueprints, which assist you basically to quickly do, for instance, ingest an on-prem data source into your data platform. So that's more on the usability front. Yeah, but they continuously improve, let's say, Glue and that part of the scope.
I do hear a lot of names, services, etc. I'm an AWS consultant, so I'm pretty much familiar with the services. But if you are new to this topic, where would you start?
That's a very good question. I think the yearly, let's say, AWS conferences are a nice place to keep informed. But where to start? Yeah, there's, for instance, we as Go Data Driven, we did an internal certification process where we had like a lot of consultants, basically participating in certification. I think that really helped a lot. Although we were quite an expert on the data field, let's say. AWS has so many services, and if you do like these certification trainings, you get basically experience in all of them. So I think that's a good way to start.
Yeah, for me, because I was not really familiar with lake formation, for instance. So a couple of weeks ago, I just started out with AWS Labs, where you can just do a lake formation lab, have some feeling with it.
Oh.
There's some cool tutorials, for instance, the Cloudtrail ingestion in lake formation. There's a really basic tutorial where you can just put your fingers on, use the techniques, and have some feeling with the services that you're not really every day on a daily basis familiar with.
Oh.
So it's easy to start and indeed get some training, get some certifications in place. But it's really, how to say that? It's an easy entry to use these services, and that's what was really fun for me to see. It's not really hard to get into it and to well, of course, the nitty-gritty bits and details, that gets harder, of course.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think these lake formation has now probably been around for 2 and a bit years. So it's now it's becoming
mature.
A polished product, and the learning curve actually initially, especially when using a resource like AWS Labs, it's quite good.
Yeah, we talked a lot about data, but one important aspect of data is, of course, what you do with the data. Machine learning is a hot topic. Do you also see some developments on that area, security, machine learning, data?
Maybe yes and no. So on the one hand, I think what we now also see is there's a lot of emphasis on data quality and data observability. Creating maybe automated metrics on your data. How many rows are ingested, trying to classify certain columns with glue crawlers, seeing if there's maybe like a credit card number or a passport number in a particular column. So these automated metrics you can actually use to maybe combined with AI and machine learning, do things like outlier and anomaly detection on those metrics and basically do alerting on top of that. So then AI basically assists you in finding anomalies.
And are there also ways, because creating and training machine learning models is quite an expensive job, and I would say that your IP of the organization is in there. Are there any aspects you should be aware of when you do such a thing in cloud? How do you secure your models?
Yeah, so I think in the end, a running model doesn't necessarily differentiate from any, let's say, container you're running in the cloud, right? So the same basic principles for securing that apply for your machine learning models as well. Being careful with credentials, making sure that the stuff the Kubernetes cluster or whatever you're running these containers on is secured. I think that all makes sense, but it's not necessarily different from running, let's say, normal applications.
No. And Martijn, do you have something from your perspective? So we are coming from a platform perspective. Mm-hmm. Do you have something to add to this entire conversation? Because are there any new AWS services which, from a platform perspective, you want to implement?
From a new service perspective, you mean? Yeah,
for example, I was thinking about AWS Macie, for example.
Yeah.
How can it help in identifying?
Yeah, I mean, from a security perspective, as we said, you can create a data lake for security data, and you have the traditional SOC use cases. If this happens and that happens, then we have an alert. But those are quite black and white, in the sense that they are true or false, positive or negative. These days, you see a lot of maybes happening, and you need machine learning or need at least AI to look at all the data that you ingest or that you collect, to give some verdict on a use case where you say, well, the chances are that this is bad and the chance is that it's 90% and then the impact is this. So you can utilize or use these services like Macie on your security data. One of the reasons a lot of companies were not using Macie was that until I think a year ago it was always running in US East 1 in AWS. So companies from the EU were saying, well, I like Macie and I like the options it has on a DLP perspective, for instance, for DLP, but I don't want my data to be processed in the US, so I will not use it. But I think nowadays it can be used in Ireland.
Yeah, and I think those services, they really help you to do things at scale, right? Because you simply can tell Macie, we have a bunch of S3 buckets and
go ahead.
I don't bother about scaling, etc.
Exactly.
So do you have any recommendations where to start on this topic? if I was a newbie?
If you were a newbie,
If I was.
yeah, again with the best practices, just use it, and it's shown on the screen. Build a data solution on a cloud foundation. Use a solid basis. Use compliance monitoring using AWS native tools. Encrypt unless, and we just discussed, you should encrypt everything at least at rest. In transit, it's a different story, and in runtime, it's also maybe a bit harder because these things cost quite some performance and add complexity. Fine-grained leaves privilege. I think that's one of the most important one because that helps you prevent a lot of incidents from happening or for data leakage, insider threats, and those kind of things.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any closing thoughts for this session for our audience?
Closing thoughts. No, I think that was a nice summary. Least privilege. I think that's also the power of AWS, maybe. Yeah. So within that's my personal preference. EIM roles, being able to give somebody access to only files starting with an A in some subdirectory of S3. I think that's the power of AWS, right? And especially with regard to data security, make use of that
and it integrates with Lake-Formation and all the other services. So you can have one centralized IAM, complex policy maybe, complex in configuration, but you can use it everywhere. Yeah. So that helps a lot.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks both for being here. Thanks for watching, the audience. Thanks for the viewers at home or at the office.